All right, let's get right into it. You'd think the U.S. policy on Russian oil would be simple, right? Basically, discourage anyone from buying it to squeeze Russia's finances. But when you start looking at the details, you stumble into this really fascinating puzzle, and it's all about two global giants, India and China.
And that brings us to the core question of this whole explainer. Why in the world is the U.S. coming down hard on one major buyer of Russian oil, while the country that's actually buying the most seems to be getting a free pass? It just doesn't add up on the surface, so we're going to dig in and figure it out.
And I mean, just look at how different the treatment is. It's night and day. India gets slammed with tariffs that have now climbed to a whopping 50%. Meanwhile, China, which is also buying Russian oil, gets, well, nothing. No new tariffs. So what is the deal here? What's happening behind closed doors?
To get to the bottom of this, we've got to follow the oil. We're going to start by unpacking the raw numbers, because they tell a really interesting story about who's buying what.
And okay, this is where the mystery really deepens. The data is crystal clear. China isn't just a buyer. It is the #1 buyer of Russian crude by a long shot. We're talking 109 million tons compared to India's 88 million. So if the whole point is to cut off Russia's main source of income, why wouldn't you focus on the biggest customer? It seems backwards.
Well, the answer starts to come into focus when we look at the specific case the White House has been building against India. See, for them, it's not just about how much oil is being bought, it's about how and why it's being bought.
And here's clue number one. Before the war in Ukraine, India barely bought any Russian oil. I mean, it was less than 1% of their total imports. It was a complete non-factor in their energy supply.
Now, fast forward to today. That number has absolutely skyrocketed to 42%. You know, this isn't just some small tweak in their supply chain. This is a massive, fundamental shift. And you can bet Washington noticed.
And this chart just shows you how sudden that pivot was. Going from practically zero to almost half of your entire country's oil imports coming from Russia, well, that looks incredibly opportunistic. And that's really the heart of the U.S. argument against India.
In fact, the U.S. administration has a specific name for what they believe is happening. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent calls it the Indian arbitrage. The accusation is pretty direct. India is buying up cheap sanctioned Russian oil, refining it, and then turning around and selling the finished products like gasoline and diesel to the global market for a huge profit.
And they've put a number on it, a big number. The administration is claiming that Indian companies have raked in about $16 billion in what they call excess profits. This changes the whole story from being about a country securing its energy needs to one about, well, alleged wartime profiteering.
And make no mistake, this isn't some low-level chatter. You've got very senior officials, people like Peter Navarro and Stephen Miller, out there in public using really strong language. They're flat out accusing India of financing Russia's war and calling their actions not acceptable. This is a full-blown, coordinated, public pressure campaign.
Okay, so the case against India seems pretty clear from Washington's perspective, but that still doesn't explain why China, the biggest buyer of all, is getting a pass. The answer to that side of the puzzle has everything to do with economic power and leverage.
See, with China, it's a completely different story. Yeah, they buy more oil in total, but look at the percentages. Their reliance on Russian oil only went up a little bit, from 13 to 16%. From the U.S. perspective, this doesn't look like a sudden, opportunistic cash grab. It just looks like a minor adjustment in an already existing energy strategy.
And then there's this huge factor that you just can't ignore: rare earths. These are elements that are absolutely essential for, well, almost all of our modern technology. We're talking everything from your phone to electric cars to advanced military weapons. And China, they basically have a monopoly on them. That gives them an incredible amount of leverage. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance basically said it out loud. He admitted the China issue is, quote, a little bit more complicated. And what he means is that you can't just make a decision about oil in a vacuum. With China, pulling on one string can unravel a dozen other things. And here are just a few of those other things. The U.S. is desperately trying to avoid a trade war that would make everything more expensive for American shoppers, especially right before Christmas. They're dealing with delicate negotiations over things like computer chips, and they're in the middle of a temporary truce on tariffs. If they push too hard on the oil issue, the whole thing could just blow up.
So we've looked at the oil numbers, we've heard the accusations against India, and we've seen the complex economic web with China. So where does that leave us? What's the final answer to our puzzle?
At the end of the day, it really comes down to this: a cold, hard mix of politics and economics. This isn't about applying one rule to every country equally.
It's about a pragmatic calculation of what the U.S. can get away with and what the potential blowback would be from each nation.
And that blowback could be massive. As Secretary of State Marco Rubio's pointed out, if the U.S. sanctioned China's enormous oil refining industry, it could totally disrupt the global market and send gas prices through the roof for everyone, including right here at home. In that scenario, the cure would be way, way worse than the disease.
And so this whole situation leaves us with a really big, thought-provoking question. It's a perfect example of realpolitik in action. And it forces us to ask, when the massive economic and national interests of powerful countries are on the line, is it even possible for foreign policy to be applied the same way for everyone?